Jacobin show. I'm Jen Pan, of course. Good to see you as always. I always forget to say this. Please hit like and subscribe and share this video with your friends if you feel compelled. Other than that, today I'll be super quick because there is a lot in the show. First of all, it is the European far right episode, by which I mean I am talking to Jonas Pontusson about the rise of the far right in Sweden. I'm also talking to our friend and Jacobin Europe editor, David Broder, about the rise of the far right in Italy. And then beyond that, I will also be talking to Alex Gourevitch, who has a new piece in Catalyst about post-work socialism and some of the various constraints and problems with that framework. So again, thank you for watching. Please hit like and subscribe. And without further ado, let's get to it. All right, so I'm now joined by David Broder. He is, of course, Jacobin's Europe editor. He's also the author of the book First They Took Rome, How the Populist Right Conquered Italy. And actually, he has an upcoming book from Pluto Press titled Mussolini's Grandchildren, Fascism in Contemporary Italy. I feel compelled to mention that you can actually pre-order this book from Pluto Press. And actually, if you order it from their website and use the code Broder20, you can get 20% off. So I will link that down below. David, first of all, it's very exciting for us to be able to share a code on this channel because we've never done that before. Obviously, having no corporate sponsorships or anything of the like. But more importantly, great to see you.
Hi, Jen. Great to see you too. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so obviously you are here to talk about the recent election in Italy and the results. You've been covering the Italian right, obviously, for quite some time. I think people know that the big news over the weekend is that Giorgia Meloni and her far-right party, the Brothers of Italy, won an election in Italy, and Meloni is now going to become the next prime minister. So obviously, this is in the context of quite a lot of far-right electoral activity in Europe more broadly lately. And so it's a little difficult sometimes to kind of keep the different far-right agendas straight. And obviously, there is quite a bit of overlap between, all of the different far-right parties across Europe. But I guess the opening question for you is, what exactly were the Brothers of Italy campaigning on? What does their platform look like? And a follow-up is, what does their electoral base look like?
Okay, so Brothers of Italy, Fratelli d'Italia, is part of a right-wing coalition, which also includes two other parties, Silvio Berlusconi's Forza Italia and the anti-immigrant Lega, led by Matteo Salvini. These other two parties were in a cross-party coalition led by Mario Draghi, former chief of the European Central Bank for the last year and a half, alongside the centre-left Democrats and Five Star. So basically, this election is the product of the downfall of that previous sort of national unity government, so-called. And when Draghi was the prime minister, very much kind of feted by the centre-left as a kind of saviour of Italy, as someone bringing in European recovery funds after the pandemic and so on. Meloni's party, Brothers of Italy, was the only opposition. And basically, this election allowed it to assert itself basically as the main party of the right-wing coalition, saying, they hadn't been in coalition before, they're not to blame for what previous governments have been doing, but at the same time kind of trying to assert themselves as not an overly destabilizing force, particularly in terms of the European recovery funds, and in terms of foreign policy, Russia and Ukraine, Italy's relation to the EU and so on. In fact, because even in advance of the election, when it was called in July, it was basically guaranteed all along that the right-wing coalition were bound to win and that Fratelli d'Italia were going to be the largest party. So actually the campaign mainly took the form of other parties sort of questioning whether Fratelli d'Italia were going to be disruptive, whether they included sort of neo-fascist figures, whether they were soft on Putin, this kind of thing. And then in response to that, Fratelli d'Italia claiming that they were being unfairly victimized and that the left ought to apologize for their own errors and crimes and their own undemocratic conduct and so on. So the actual policy content of the campaign was very thin, including with regard to issues like energy bills, which in fact most Italians said was their main, the thing that most concerns them. Broadly, Fratelli d'Italia is a party that centres its message on a very harsh nationalist identity politics, the defence of the natural family. At times in the past, that has, even in the recent past, that's involved things like great replacement theory, claiming that the left plans ethnic substitution of whites in alliance with speculators like George Soros and this kind of thing. But in this campaign, it basically mixed some of that kind of identity politics with the message that actually on the economy and on foreign policy, it won't be too disruptive. In terms of who votes for them, basically, I think it's kind of too easy to sort of assume that, well, they're this like rebellious force, so therefore they're like mobilizing disgruntled, left behind, working class voters, this kind of thing. But really, actually, if you look at the electorate and the overall right wing vote, where the votes have come from, it's quite clear that basically what's happened is that Fratelli d'Italia, Brothers of Italy, now has basically won votes from its own allies. The overall right wing vote is basically the same as it was in the 1990s and 2000s. Kind of mid 40s%. So in that sense, there's not really an expansion of the electorate. There are, of course, certain changes which have happened as Fratelli d'Italia has become a bigger party. I mean, in 2018, it only got 4%. So it was then had a very identitarian electorate that probably previously belonged to other sort of neo-fascist parties, whereas this time it had a lot more things like holding a conference where it sort of showed off its business credentials, including a few other kind of former Berlusconi ministers and that kind of thing, in order to sort of project the image of a sort of broader right-wing party, but within which the sort of old neo-fascist tradition is still somehow part.
So that brings up something interesting, which is, in your articles, part of what you have argued is that this rise was, on one hand, kind of a long time in the making, and that the center right, supposedly more moderate, or supposedly, parties that were supposed to be like a moderating force, actually enabled and helped accelerate the rise of the far right. So how exactly has this played out over the last couple of years?
Well, as I said, there's this coalition of these three right-wing parties, and the first time they went to government together was already in 1994. Silvio Berlusconi, the billionaire tycoon, often compared to Trump and so on, he kind of gave a speech in 2019 where he said, well, in the 1990s I brought the fascists into government. He actually used the word fascists. I constitutionalized and legitimized them. I sort of brought them into the tent. But over time, while he had a dominant position in the right-wing coalition in the 90s and 2000s, that's kind of ebbed, particularly in the post-2008 crisis period, partly because Berlusconi has often gone into a sort of broad tent or technocratic governments, which has sort of undermined his hold on the right. And then in terms of push voters towards the further right options, we saw Matteo Salvini's Lega, even before this, took over the leadership of the right wing from Berlusconi. But then also, I think there's a strange kind of reinvention of Berlusconi in recent years as a kind of cuddlier and more moderate figure, which is rather strange for anyone who remembers the 2000s. It bears obvious comparison with the way in which George W. Bush how his legacy has been sort of reinterpreted by parts of the US, sort of centrist and centre-right, in the wake of Trump, in the sense that a figure who was previously seen as extreme and as pushing away from the imagined, more moderate traditions of his party, then in turn becomes the golden age who was longed for. But yeah, I mean, Berlusconi's government's played an important role in questioning the kind of anti-fascist identity of the Italian Republic, in focusing policy on harsh attacks on immigrants, and in electing or appointing former fascists to ministerial roles. It should also be said, though, that this isn't only a process from coming within the right-wing coalition, and over time we've seen centre-left media and centre-left politicians also go in for this, in adopting a quite indulgent view of Meloni, including a notable kind of amnesia over even quite recent statements which clearly point to her connection to a specifically neo-fascist tradition.
Mm-hmm. So, I think that actually raises another question, which is, we know that turnout in this election was incredibly, incredibly low. Why couldn't either moderates or the left mobilize their bases in this election against the ascendance of the far right?
So part of the reason why the right won a majority of seats, even with 44% of the vote, is an electoral system that rewards coalitions. So on the right, there was a united four-party front, whereas the various opposition forces, most importantly the Democrats, who are the sort of historic kind of liberal Europeanist party, and then Five Star, which is a quite newer and more eclectic force, they didn't make an agreement to run together. And then there were also various kind of smaller forces, both more centrist and on sort of further left as well. So I think that the problem is that the Democrats, who are the most important party, which are called centre-left, in fact, I think we could say a better definition would be to call them a kind of progressive neoliberal party, which combines basically liberal economics with we've embraced the European Union, some civil rights stances and so on. They ran their election campaign basically as trying to mobilise voters' fear of the danger, or maybe even just, as they would put it, incompetence of the right-wing parties. So in that sense, they did try and rally what could be called loosely an anti-fascist vote. But at the same time, they didn't make the electoral coalition, which could have made the election even remotely competitive. So because there was simply no chance that the divided centre and centre-left would win, the whole idea of the kind of useful, pragmatic vote basically mobilised very few. The Five Star Movement did a quite different kind of campaign, which was very focused on its economic record in government, and even though it had a quite strange path when it was in government, because it was in coalition at different points with the Lega, sort of far right, and at a different point with the Democrats over the last few years, before joining Draghi's National Unity government, they very much played up a more kind of social image, so particularly unemployment benefits, which they introduced in 2019 for the first time, and also a €9 an hour minimum wage. And Italy currently has no minimum wage. So from a very poor initial polling position of about 8 or 9%, Five Star eventually got 15. So although that wasn't a great result for them, it showed a certain ability to mobilise basically southern working class voters. Overall, I think beyond the sort of specific tactics of the election, what we see is indeed a massive abandonment of electoral engagement by working class and southern voters, most of whom do not vote. And the overall turnout was 64%. That mightn't sound that bad in the US context, right, if you think, But actually Italy in the 70s and 80s had 92, 93, 94% turnout in elections. It used to have big mass parties, particularly a communist party, very rooted in working class life and communities. And so the left, well, what passes for the left now is something very different to that, because one kind of indicative thing I think is there was a kind of a satirical program which did like a fake advert for each of the parties, and the one they did for the Democrats was like an advert to not vote, and the idea was basically like the less people vote, the better the Democrats will do, because as everyone in Italy is known, the Democrats are the party of older and wealthier Italians. Like the more your income, the more likely you are to vote for them. And they also have a very old electorate. I think, there's obviously after the election, there's been a lot of sort of discussion on the centre left, like should they have run together with Five Star and this kind of thing? Or, should they even have run with kind of even more hawkish neoliberal centrists who also had a separate campaign? But, really the issue isn't that they didn't, band together the votes they had. It's that, millions of vote, to put it in very schematic terms, the Democrat Party got 5 million votes. In 2006, the coalition of the same forces got 19 million votes. So there's just been a very drastic drop-off in its social base.
Yeah. I do want to ask you about Meloni herself, because, there's obviously been a lot of media coverage around her. Lots of people have sort of described her as like a new female Mussolini. And as you pointed out, Italy has sort of had a kind of long history of various populist strongmen kind of rising to power. You, of course, had mentioned Berlusconi. So the question, I guess, is Meloni kind of a continuation of Mussolini or Berlusconi? Or is she just something completely different?
Well, here I am again tempted to plug my book and the title Mussolini's Grandchildren, because I think the important thing is that there is a genealogy, there is a continuation, but it's also different.
Yeah.
Often when we think of, often when we talk about, is, Marine Le Pen or Trump or maybe Bolsonaro, these other examples, we ask if they're fascist, and often the debate gets kind of ground down in the question of whether or not we think that it's important that they reflect the kind of political forms that were typical of the interwar period. The social violence, the veterans, the sort of rising revolutionary movements, this kind of thing. But I think what's very interesting about the case of Meloni and Brothers of Italy is that there's actually a direct organizational continuity from the end of World War II to now. Her party even has in its logo, and she explicitly defends the tradition of the MSI, which was the party created by the defeated supporters of Mussolini in 1946. In fact, it was only made up of the cadres who had followed Mussolini right to the end of the war in the fight alongside Nazi Germany against the partisans. So that was for a very long time a party in post-war democracy that kind of struggled to sort of force itself into sort of real sort of national, the area of parties that could be in government, and was very much like a party of veterans who sort of longed for what they saw as the better days when they had their regime. But then, so over time, though, there were kind of important changes, particularly in the sense that while, say, in the 1960s and 70s was a very violent period in Italian politics, and of course, into the 80s, the leaders of the 1940s were still around and still in charge of the party. Now that generation has passed, the Cold War is over, there's no longer a mass communist party. So Meloni joined the MSI in 1992, and that was also pretty much the period when it was first going into national government. Berlusconi, in his first coalition in 1994, he included the MSI, they kind of made some sort of symbolic moves away from the tradition of the regime, in particular by condemning its anti-Semitism, the racial laws, the Holocaust. And indeed, the parties ultimately merged. MSI directly, which became Alleanza Nazionale, renamed itself. Then it directly joined Berlusconi's party. But then the problem with that sort of progression, the sort of image of sort of moderation, is that Fratelli d'Italia, Brothers of Italy, was actually created in 2012 as a split and as a partial rejection of that merger, which actually reclaimed the tradition of post-war neo-fascism. So in Meloni's party, they openly venerate the leaders of the post-war MSI, who declared themselves to be fascists. They also have a certain brand of kind of conspiracy theory, racism, the exclusivist idea of the national community drawn from that past, but they also try and integrate it into a sort of wider conservatism. And basically the relationship with Berlusconi and also figures like Salvini has sort of helped them do that. Really what they've succeeded in doing is breaking down any kind of boundary between centre-right and far-right. So their ideas and their reference points no longer seem extreme because they've been normalised as sort of part of the general sort of right-wing cultural mass. So yeah, I mean, I think of course, I wrote an article for the New York Times, which then was very much perceived in Italy as, I had called Meloni a fascist, and then there was a lot of reaction against that. And Meloni herself, she was interviewed for La Stampa, which is a daily newspaper in Turin, and said, well, of course, we're not going to, establish a dictatorship. But it's a quite strange thing to say because, of course, one would hope that would be the bare minimum. But I think, we're not going to see like a fascist regime. I mean, that's a kind of ludicrous idea of what could happen. What's much more likely is something more akin to the kind of things we see with governments like Viktor Orban's in Hungary, in which there's a certain kind of empowerment of the executive, very harsh attacks on opposition groups, maybe even some sort of constitutional changes, although it seems unlikely that Meloni will actually have a big enough majority to do that. Mm-hmm. So I think it's part of a longer term erosion of certainly of anti-fascist sort of standards, but also of a certain kind of erosion of the kind of more kind of participatory idea of democracy. It's a rise of sort of identity politics and so on. But I don't think it's not right to put it in the terms of like the overthrow of what went before, because it's not like that. It's radicalization of a process that's been going on for a long time.
So maybe let's wrap up on that question, because obviously, I think people are wondering what comes next, right? So, you started answering a little bit of this, but what do you think Meloni and Brothers of Italy will actually be able to achieve in government? What are they going to try to do? Do you think that they have any sort of long-term staying power? And then finally, what kinds of opposition or sort of institutional barriers or obstacles will they come up against?
Well, I think that one thing that's important to state as well is that they've made a very big deal in the run up to this election of the fact of their intention to not sort of upset Italy's place in the international order. So they made a very big deal of their commitment to NATO, of their support for Ukraine. They kind of distanced themselves from some of the previous kind of pro Putin stuff, which had been very explicitly like, Putin is good because he defends Christian civilization, and replaced that with a much more hostile position, even to the extent that a lot of liberal media painted Salvini rather than Meloni as the real kind of destabilizing force. Also in economic matters, they promised some very severe tax cuts and indeed a flat tax rate to get rid of progressive income tax, which would blow an enormous hole in the public finances, like 100 billion euros a year. I think in practice, actually, they're not going to be able to do that part of their agenda, also because the energy crisis is so severe that they'll actually have to pursue a more interventionist agenda than they'll even want to. I feel, in fact, that because the government is likely to be so mediocre in its economic performance and also change little in foreign policy terms, it will actually be tempted to make a bigger deal of sort of identitarian and sort of divisive policies, which are basically intended to harden a kind of right-wing base behind itself. There's a lot of churn in the right-wing electorate. Probably more than half of Meloni's voters voted for Salvini's Lega only 3 or 4 years ago. So I think in order to try and rally them behind her, it's very likely that she'll do things like, we've seen proposed before, ideas like a constitutional change which would criminalize apologism for communist totalitarianism and Islamic extremism. This, of course, the idea being that that kind of law could be used to kind of squash various types of opposition. I think a big deal as well is that she's promised a naval blockade of the Mediterranean in order to stop migrants from crossing. I think, of course, the idea of literally blockading the whole Mediterranean is impossible, but certainly we can imagine things like clashes between the Navy and rescue boats, sort of war with NGOs, this kind of thing, migrant rescue NGOs. I think, and of course also we're one other thing is that, this is a government which is hostile to things like the idea of allowing migrants, children born in Italy, to get Italian citizenship, and which has even talked about forcing businesses owned by non-EU nationals to pay huge amounts of tax up front, this kind of thing. So I think that in that sense it is much more likely that we'll see kind of lots of little wars around these kind of issues, rather than a sort of a sort of upsurge of sort of authoritarianism in that sense. I think it's also difficult to tell in a way how long it might last. The right-wing parties together have a big parliamentary majority, but there's a very strong tendency in Italian politics for the coalitions to kind of swap and switch even during the parliament. The right-wing parties stood for election together, but that doesn't mean they have to stay together. I think there are certain fault lines within the coalition, particularly if, as we probably ought to expect, it will very soon head into a quite deep recession. So I think, though the caveat I put on that is I don't think we can expect, there's a big crisis, so therefore it's good because then she collapses, because that could produce other kinds of negative consequences as well, in terms of the general direction of politics has been for sort of solidaristic policies and mobilization on the basis of working class interests to become ever more absent, and for various kind of right wing forms of reaction, ideas of tax cutting to create jobs and stuff, even to become much more central to all political discourse. So I think even if there is kind of deep stabilization, it doesn't mean that what eventually replaces her will be better.
All right, David Broder, again, we have to shout out his forthcoming book, Mussolini's Grandchildren, Fascism in Contemporary Italy. That is coming out from Pluto Press. And if you order the book from the Pluto Press website, you can get 20% off with the code BRODER20. David, great to see you as always. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
All right, I am now joined by Jonas Pontusson. He is professor of comparative politics at the University of Geneva and a leading researcher on Swedish social democracy. He's joining us today to give some context around the recent Swedish election. Jonas, great to see you.
Thanks for having me.
So I think, as you know, most people watching are well aware, recently Sweden held an election, and the far right party, the Sweden Democrats, made rather significant and somewhat surprising gains. I think people are probably also aware that, you know, the Sweden Democrats are they have sort of put forward anti-immigrant sentiments. They've been sort of sounding the alarm on crime. I think people probably also know that they have roots in Swedish neo-Nazi. The Swedish neo-Nazi right, although, of course, in recent decades, in recent years, they've been trying to disavow that. So maybe just to begin broadly, how exactly would you characterize the current political platform of the Sweden Democrats, and where from Sweden do they draw most of their support?
So the Sweden Democrats are a right-wing populist party, as we call them, political scientists. I think, and as you said, it is often said that they have neo-Nazi roots that many other right-wing populist parties do not. And I suppose in that sense, maybe there is a comparison here with Italy and the brothers of Italy. That, though, as you also noted, I think the Sweden Democrats themselves would say, we've been getting rid of Nazis over the last 20 years and sort of adopting anti-discrimination platforms and charters and sort of purging their ranks of the very radical right. And I don't know actually, or I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows exactly how important those sort of fascist roots might be or might become. They are also distinguished as being perhaps the most working class party in Sweden today. Certainly, if you look at members of parliament in the parliament that is now being replaced, in which they had let me check here. They had 62 members of parliament, and I believe that at least 30, if not 40, of those members of parliament came from backgrounds that we categorize as sort of manual workers or lower middle class or something, which is a very high percentage by Swedish standards. The Swedish Social Democrats are overwhelmingly university educated, the people who sit in the parliament these days. So they have a kind of working class profile, and they have a kind of radical right past, and those two things are in some tension with each other. They get a lot of votes, and I can talk a little bit more about this from working class voters, or that's certainly the category of voters in terms of, if we look at Swedes usually divide the electorate into self-employed workers and then white-collar employees with and without university education. And among workers, the Sweden Democrats now haven't overtaken, but they're running neck to neck with the Social Democrats, which is no other party has ever done that. So they appeal to, and they also, in contrast to the Social Democrats, appeal a lot to self-employed people. So they do well among the self-employed, and they do well among workers, and they do very badly among university educated people. Surprise, surprise. I mean, this is a story that we know.
Right.
I think that related to how well they're doing among workers is, I think that among the European populist radical right parties these days, they are probably one of the most welfare chauvinist parties, in the sense that they present themselves as defenders of the welfare state. They're also against immigration, or they would like to impose restrictions on immigration, but they present themselves as defenders of the welfare state. In the last, after the last election in 2018, there was discussion about whether or not they would form part of a right-wing or right bloc government, coalition government, and those negotiations fell apart. And one of the Swedes refer to them as bourgeois parties, meaning non-left parties. One of those parties decided to support the Social Democrats for the Social Democratic government instead. Interestingly, there was some debate about immigration, and there are numbers of value issues on which liberals and centrists consider this party to be maybe out of, or at least did consider it to be out of the mainstream. But one of the biggest stumbling blocks in those negotiations was that the Sweden Democrats wanted to increase the generosity of unemployment benefits, which had been cut by previous governments. And that was, in some sense, I think, for the conservatives and the liberals, that was as big a problem as anything they had to say about gay marriage or something like that. They have become, and the entire Swedish debate has become very focused recently on crime, and so they are anti-immigration, but almost more so than being anti-immigration. In the campaign, they've been anti-crime and sort of tough on law and order, increase prison sentences, send home immigrants who are found guilty of crimes. But it's become very much a law order crime, and obviously and strengthening the army. And clearly the crisis in Ukraine, or the war in Ukraine, in some sense helped them.
Yeah, so I want to stay on that question because, especially what you say, given their sort of working class base, that's a very interesting question because I think, at least here in the US, when you see working class voters sort of turn to right populist politicians or parties, I think, and anti-immigration sentiment or, fears about crime as well. I think often what underlies that is a growing sense of economic inequality, economic anxiety. We saw that obviously in 2016 in the US with the election of Trump and, a significant part of sort of blue collar voters in the Midwest turning to Trump after years of voting for Democrats. And I want to ask you about this in the Swedish context, of course, because obviously compared to the US, we tend to think of Sweden as one of the most equal places on earth with a very generous social safety net and welfare state. And so I guess the question for you is, what kinds of longer term changes to Sweden's economy and, the welfare state and trade union movements may have come before this moment that could have precipitated the rise or helped precipitate the rise of the Sweden Democrats?
When we look at this specific election, the shift between the left and the right was tiny, less than 0.5 percentage points. So we were already in a very tight situation in 2018. As I said, the Center Party chose to ally with the left, or chose to become a supporter of the left rather than entering into a negotiation with the populists. That party lost badly in the election, in this current election. The Liberals lost badly in the current election, and the Christian Democrats lost badly in the current election. If you look at the sort of original three left parties, they lost badly in 2006 and in 2010 and in 2014. But in this election, their combined vote share, Social Democrats, Left, and Greens, actually increased. So in that sense, as you rightly say, what happened in this election has to do with kind of a recomposition of the the center right, or the right bloc, a recomposition of the right bloc, and now a kind of symbolic acceptance of the populists that had. So the story is really about the Swedish right in this particular election, I think. Going back to this picture we have of Sweden as, lots of people have, I sometimes share it, and in any case, I profit from it since it gives me an opportunity to talk a lot. So when the Social Democrats were in power in between 1994 2006, they pursued a series of policies which, in the European context, we often refer to as the third way. And those policies involved reducing marginal income taxes on the rich. This was an agreement with the bourgeois parties. So a kind of reducing the progressive taxation, if you want to call it that, and capping overall taxation, putting lots of money into tertiary education, and trying to maintain public services and financing some of that by reducing unemployment insurance compensation, sick pay, and social assistance, and introducing, and this was all done in the name of increasing people's employability, social investment, investing in children instead of spending on consumption, spending on investment, and that this would generate a more equal society, in the long run. If you look at the distribution of income among working age households, and I like to leave the elderly out. It's a kind of special category. But if you look at the Gini coefficient, which is only one of many measures, of course, of inequality, but if you look at disposable household income, working age households, the Gini coefficient, which is it ranges between 0 and 1, and if you are at 1, then if the smaller the number is, the more equal the society is. I can talk about that if you want. But the Gini coefficient for disposable income increased by 37% from 1992 to 2018. So disposable income inequality has grown a lot. And what is striking is that in Sweden, this is somewhat different from a number of other countries, the Gini coefficient for market income, that is to say, people's earnings, household earnings before taxes and transfers, only increased by 13%. So more than half and nearly 2/3 of the increase in inequality has happened through changes in the tax system and the income transfer system. So it's really the welfare state that has been in some ways reconfigured, and the Social Democrats were not the only people who did this. The non-left parties were in power in the early 90s and again from 2006 to 2014. But the Social Democrats did not reverse what those bourgeois governments had done, and in fact, in many ways, I think, initiated changes that contributed this kind of retreat from redistribution. And to go back to something you were hinting at when you were talking about populist voters in the US and so on, I think a lot of Swedish working class voters kind of they observe inequality. Their households are struggling much more, especially after or since 2008. Their households are struggling in a way they were not they are convinced, with fairly good reason, that mainstream parties of the left and the right are not going to do anything. They haven't done anything for 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
Taxing the rich is not an option. And according to all of these parties, we have maxed out on overall taxation or overall public spending. Welfare chauvinism becomes a fairly rational way to try to deal with this problem from the point of view of quote unquote native Swedes, and also from the point of view of some immigrants who've been around for 20, 30 years or something like that. So now the pie to be redistributed isn't going to grow. And now we're looking for some criteria whereby I and my household and my community can improve get more from this pie, and saying that from the point of view of these people, saying that people who have yet to become citizens or people who have lived here for less than 10 years, maybe that's a fair criterion for deciding who gets unemployment benefits and who doesn't, or who gets child care subsidies and who doesn't. So in that sense, I think many of us political scientists kind of attribute the problems of the left to these cultural issues, gay marriage, multiculturalism, all the woke things that the left is doing. And in my opinion, I don't want to say that isn't a problem in the eyes of working class voters, but I think the problem is very much about material grievances, and the fact that the left isn't speaking to or hasn't spoken, has kind of retreated from or taken we are responsible for managing the economy and this comes first,
right,
kind of position.
Yeah, I want to stay on that question because you had mentioned something very interesting, which is that the left actually did make gains this election, although, obviously not to the extent that the Sweden Democrats did. So, you've talked about the sort of failure of the moderate or centrist parties, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on why, the left was not able to counter or stop the rise of the Sweden Democrats. Because like you say, the warning signs, I think, have been here for quite some time.
Right. I think it brings us to two things. And you asked about unions earlier. And there's a big problem on that front. We all, or you all Americans, but many Europeans too, looking at Sweden, think of it as this very strong trade union movement with very high rates of unionization and so on. What we've failed to recognize often, I think, is that, in fact, there are three trade union movements in Sweden. There is a worker, blue-collar set of trade unions, which don't organize white-collar employees at all. And all of those unions are affiliated with this confederation, which is called LO. And then there is white-collar equivalents of LO, sectoral unions organizing nurses and doctors in the public sector, employees of private industry and so on. And then there's a third set of unions, which are professional unions, which organize only people with particular university degrees, medical doctors, lawyers, engineers, what have you. The blue-collar LO unions or worker unions, they used to organize about 85% of the working class in this kind of blue-collar sense of the word in 1994. And today they organize about 60%. So they've lost that. Just not only has that part of the population shrunk, but union density in that group has declined by 25 percentage points. The white-collar unions, and especially the professional unions, have been growing, So there are the kind of the upper unions in the upper part of the Swedish labor force are doing very well and are continuing to do well, but the blue collar unions have been doing very badly and have become very preoccupied with trying to retain their members. And as a result of that, I think they've distanced themselves from the Social Democrats, and they've kind of tried to become less politically active. They were, and they still are, affiliated with the Social Democratic Party in some sense. Everybody who's a leader of one of these unions is a Social Democrat. But partly because the Social Democrats have sort of gone their own way and become more white collar in their orientation, but also because of the populist threat, and we can't so among LO members in the last election, or at least in a survey that was done in May, even among LO members, the populists are nearly neck and neck with the Social Democrats, and this makes it hard for the unions to mobilize strongly against the populist threat, as it were. I think so. There is so the weakening of the blue collar unions has kind of implied, and this again is a process that's been in the making for decades now, has sort of made it harder for the connection between the Social Democrats and sort of normal working class people. Have got those unions used to be the kind of crucial intermediary, and they are both much weaker than they were and much more defensive, and in some sense trying to prevent membership losses by being more apolitical in a sense. So unionization, I think, is an important, or union losses in the blue collar ranks is an important part of that story. The other thing I was going to say, and again, this part of the problem resonates with Trumpism and populism in many other countries. The most striking thing, if you look at the election results and where did the populists do well and badly, one thing that's very clear is that they do well among men and much less well among women. But the other thing is they did badly in Stockholm, and they did not as badly, but quite badly in Gothenburg and Malmö. So there's three big cities, and in Stockholm, so their national vote share was 20.5%, and in Stockholm their vote share was 10%. So they're running at half their national vote share in the city of Stockholm, and everywhere else they do well. So it is partly, and it's not so much the rural areas. The north of Sweden, which is probably the poorest, has always been a stronghold of the left and of trade unions. But in the southern third of the country, small towns, they are really doing very, very well. And I think that, to me, is a problem for, and here, I mean, it's easy to blame the Social Democrats, but I think that left parties in general, or the left in general, let's put it that way, has always had a problem dealing with regional inequalities. And regional inequalities in all, certainly in European countries, and even more so in the United States, have grown phenomenally. I mean, much of the inequality that we've seen in the last 20, 30 years has taken a spatial form, I think. And to the extent that the left talks about inequality and does anything about it, it's about gender, it's about income, possibly class, or maybe it was about class once upon a time. but I think the left has a very hard time sort of thinking about and proposing policies that address regional issues. If you look at regions and how poor they are relative to the richest region in their country, this is a very good predictor of the populist vote share, basically. So that as regions fall behind, populism thrives. Mm-hmm. And actually, in the Swedish case, I think it's interesting because the Sweden Democrats don't talk about this as an issue because they're nationalists. So they talk about Swedes versus immigrants, or they talk about crime, or they talk about Russia. So they themselves are they're not promising regional aid, but they are clearly tapping into material grievances which are very much related to regional development. And the city of Stockholm has grown phenomenally, both in terms of housing and how many people live there, but just in terms of economic growth. And it's again a very similar story in the US. And I think if the left, if a kind of social democratic reformist left is ever going to kind of roll back populist gains, I think being able to speak to this set of issues, there, to put it very crudely, we are never going to regain the working class by criminalizing gay marriage. I mean, this is not an important issue to these people, right? In my opinion, I mean, it's right. It's just not. I mean, they may nod when somebody says that that gay marriage is a problem, but it's not what they're voting on, or it's not the core of what their issues are. Mm-hmm. And if we want to address core concerns and sort of pull the rug out from underneath the populace, then I think speaking to issues about regional development and which can also be related to green transition and sort of alternative growth models, or thinking in terms of something in which financial markets and metropolitan areas don't just drive everything.
Right. So maybe then let's wrap up on the question of what possibly comes next. Of course, we don't really know at this point what's going to happen with the coalition government, but just on a very general level, what do you think these election results and a possible right-wing coalition government could mean, not just for the future of Swedish politics, but also for the future of Sweden's social democracy? Because, as you mentioned, the Sweden Democrats are what you call welfare chauvinists, and I'm wondering how you think that's going to change the safety net programs and the welfare state going forward.
Yep. I don't mean to take up too much time, but I think we actually know exactly what will happen in the near future. There will be a right government. Mm-hmm. It will almost certainly in that government there will almost certainly be two parties, the conservatives and the Christian Democrats. The liberals will be a support party outside the government. They will never vote, or they have said they will never vote for a government that has populists holding ministerial portfolios. So the liberals will not vote for populists in the government, and the populists will retaliate by not voting for liberals in the government. So we will end up with a two-party minority government, which draws on liberal and populist votes in parliament. And in order for those two parties to support the government, they need to be given committee assignments and policy promises or policy concessions. There was a vote today, so I'm a little bit on Swedish politics. So the Speaker of Parliament was elected today. It was thought that the populists would present a candidate. They chose not to present the candidate. The conservative, who had been speaker already, remain Speaker of the in the Parliament. The first vice chair is a social democrat. The second vice chair is a populist. So committee assignments are going to be put around, and the populists, at least now, are, they're celebrating their victory. They are now they now have a speakership, second vice, but in any case, it's something. They are going to get 2 committee chairs and 2 committee vice chairs or something like that, and they see this as now finally being recognized as part of the political system or something like that. And a year from now, my guess is that so right now they're kind of playing game and being nice. And a year from, and the question, I think, is how hard will they push on policy issues over the next year? My guess is they are the biggest party on the right. They have been playing nice, and I'm guessing that they will insist on quite a few policy concessions, and there is at least a distinct possibility that the Liberal Party will then split, and that some group of Liberal MPs, it would only take 3 of them, would choose no longer to support this government, and therefore it would open up, and this is what the Social Democrats are waiting for, a kind of liberal, centrist, social democratic, big coalition in the middle kind of thing. And I think my guess is that if I were betting, I would think that that's probably the most likely thing that will, right. I don't think that this government, so I think we know, not exactly, but we know pretty well what the government will look like that is formed in the next 2 weeks. I don't think that government will be around 2 years from now, and in that sense, it's possible that the answer to your question, what are the long-term implications, is not very much will change, actually. And I think one question becomes sort of to what extent. Yeah. So back up a little bit. I'd say one scenario is that the government falls apart in less than 2 years. The other scenario is the government persists, and if the government persists, the populists will probably lose because they will become implicated in a set of policy deals which they wouldn't have liked. So in some sense, from a kind of electoral mobilization point of view, the best thing that could happen to the Sweden Democrats is probably that the government falls apart before the next election. If they have to enter the next election as a government party, I think that will weaken them in a way. My own sense is that public opinion, and this includes not only blue-collar workers, but lots of educated Swedes still are very supportive of welfare state provisions. In some sense, on the one hand, nothing has been done to expand the welfare state or make it more redistributive. But on the other hand, I think the things that have been done are probably as far as you can go, at least with regard to social insurance programs, pensions, unemployment insurance, and so on. And also in private services, we've seen a lot of in public services, we've seen a lot of privatization, outsourcing of janitors and caretakers and things like that. It's not obvious to me that, I think the more radical things that, it's not obvious to me that a lot more can be done in that domain. And the question then becomes, so it's really more in the domain of multiculturalism, language support for immigrants, in the domain of crime and so on, that perhaps we would see relatively big changes.
Mm.
My hunch is that none of those changes are going to address the material grievances of populist voters in some sense. And in fact, with respect to crime and so on, if these changes would have any positive effects, we wouldn't see them for another 10 years or something like that. So in that sense, I don't think that these are. Maybe symbolically the populists can claim credit for it, but I don't think that these are things that are going to really change a lot. And so we're going to be muddling through, and that maybe is that a good thing, or is that a bad thing? But and
to be continued.
I keep hoping that the Social Democrats will will begin to rethink their economic policies, their redistributive policies, would begin to think more about what can we do to strengthen trade unions, which have all been things that have just not been on their policy agenda, I think.
Yeah.
And one keeps hoping that, and maybe if they are in opposition and we do have a populist influenced majority government, but their temptation is always to say we have to take responsibility, right? That's been the social democratic thing in Sweden for the last 50 years. If there is a big crisis or big problems, Ukraine, whatever, we are, even when we're in opposition, they are saying more or less explicitly, even when we're in opposition, we are the responsible party.
Yeah.
And there we are.
All right. Again, Jonas Pontusson is a professor of comparative politics at the University of Geneva. Jonas, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
So I will be back in a minute with Alex Gourevitch, but first, of course, a word from our sponsor, Verso Books.
Join the Verso Book Club and support the future of radical publishing. Subscribers get every book that Verso publishes each month, as well as 1 to 3 books in the mail if you choose a print subscription. All Verso Book Club members also get 50% off everything on the website for as long as you're a subscriber. Join in September and get your first month free. This month's selections are Cannibal Capitalism, How Our System is Devouring Democracy, Care, and the Planet, and What We Can Do About It by Nancy Fraser, an analysis of contemporary capitalism's insatiable appetite and a rallying cry for everyone who wants to stop it from devouring our world. Self-Defense, A Philosophy of Violence by Elsa Dorland, a look across the global history of the left tracing the politics, philosophy, and ethics of self-defense. The 2023 Verso Radical Diary and Weekly Planner, a week-to-view planner for keeping track of the year ahead. And Microverses, Observations from a Shattered Present by Dylan Riley, over 100 short essays inviting us to think about society and social theory in new ways. Become a member today at versobooks.com.
All right, I am now here with Alex Gourevitch. He is a professor of political science at Brown University and the author of the book From Slavery to the Cooperative Commonwealth. And he's joining us today to talk about his latest article for Catalyst, which is titled Post-Work Socialism? Alex, great to see you.
Thanks for inviting me.
So the title of your article says it all. You have some questions with post-work socialism. And I want to just start with kind of basic definitions, I guess, because I think, for lots of people who are watching this program, probably are vaguely or, very familiar with what post-work or anti-work mean. And, for my part, I remember kind of anti-work and post-work having a big moment after Occupy. Full disclosure, that's when I first was acquainted with it, and I thought it was very interesting. There's a lot of it that I still agree with. I think, right after Occupy, everybody I knew who was in a reading group was reading Kathy Week's book, The Problem with Work. And, I think more recently, we've seen another kind of second wave of interest in post-work / anti-work because of the kind of dialogue around the so-called Great Resignation, right? So, I should say that in your piece, you are quite clear that you find value in a lot of post-work thinking as well. So maybe just to kind of kick off, how exactly would you characterize post-work or anti-work thinking? And before we get to some of your questions and criticisms, what do the post-work theorists get right?
Cool. Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say that post-work socialism is one kind of answer to the general socialist question of what kind of freedom is a future socialist society offering its members? Mm-hmm. And their answer is it's a society without work. And it's a society without work because it's one in which nobody's forced to work because everybody gets an unconditional basic income or some other way of unconditionally supplying them with their basic needs. And importantly, it's a society also where there's no work ethic. So it's a society in which you won't be ostracized or dishonored or shamed or fail to have some public standing if you choose not to work. Mm-hmm. And those are kind of equally important, I think, in post-work thinking, because the thought is if you gave everyone a UBI, as the unconditional basic income is known, and they had everything they need to live, but you still had the work ethic that's in some way familiar to us, people would still feel kind of such intense social pressure to work, to do something specific with their time, that they wouldn't really enjoy free time. Mm. And so the post-work socialist vision is an answer to that question of what kind of freedom do we enjoy in a future society by saying it's a society not just freed from work, but where people really have free time. Their whole lives are lives of free time to do what they like. Okay. And it's, said like that, it's obviously a very compelling view. And I'll say that it's sort of, in a way, it's a kind of view that when I first got really interested in Marxism, it was through the question, well, if we have so much technology, why do people work so much? That was sort of a question I asked somebody who then was like, "You're a Marxist," and I was like, "Really? Right. I don't think so." And then I was like, "Oh, it turned out I had been taught Marx badly," and so on. So I came to it through there, and then I remember the Kathy Weeks moment. I actually had a conversation with her at I think New York Public Library, or not New York Public Library, but Brooklyn. Anyway, when that came out, and I remember it, and it was a big moment, and I was really taken by that book as an expression of this view. So so that's what post-work socialism is, and in its many variants. It's an answer to the kind of freedom that we should enjoy.
Right. And you've hinted at this, but what do you think that they get right, the post-work theorists, before we move into some of the other questions?
Sure. There's a few things I think they get right. So one is they obviously get right something that a lot of people can agree with, which is that there are many jobs in our society that are unnecessary, that suck, that are super exploitative, or that even if they are in some way necessary, important, are done under really unacceptable, exploitative conditions. So they get right, I think, a basic thought that our way of organizing labor is through force, compulsion, domination. That's the central mechanism by which a capitalist society gets most of its labor to be done. I think it also gets right a thought that the way the work ethic functions in our society is to kind of induce cooperation with that subordination. Mm-hmm. We'll get to it later. Maybe I disagree with how they interpret the work ethic, but I do think they get aspects of that right. And the other thing I think they get right is that there's a real promise to technology, at least some post-work socialists. I mean, it's there's a lot of different sub-views, but right. I'd say the pulse of especially the people who are more kind of futuristic, like Nick Cernicek and Alex Williams, mm-hmm. to a degree Kathy Weeks, that there's this immense productive potential that capitalism generated and continues to generate, but which seems to, instead of reducing the hours of labor anybody has to work, seems to, on the one hand, just produce unemployment, mm-hmm. and on the other hand, make work kind of worse. Mm-hmm. That's just a standard Marxian thought, and I think that it's an important thought for them when they think about why we could have a post-work future. So I think those are three important thoughts that form a kind of jumping off point for them. Mm-hmm.
Right. So maybe now let's turn to the question of UBI, Universal Basic Income, which you had brought up earlier, because as you point out, this is kind of like the main sort of policy proposal of the post-work thinkers. I will say just very briefly for UBI, it's a little bit confusing because I think over the last couple of years, there's been kind of some mainstream dialogue or like mainstream confusion around this idea of UBI, where sometimes when people say UBI, what they're proposing is not actually universal or, it's not actually basic, by which I mean it won't actually ensure anybody a basic standard of living. Putting all of that aside, what the post-work theorists are proposing, of course, is a universal basic income that, like I said, everybody gets, regardless of whatever. It's actually 100% universal and basic in the sense that it will actually ensure a sort of floor of standard of living for everybody. That sounds great, and as you alluded to earlier, that does seem like something that would kind of undercut the power of employers and of capitalists. I think it was Eric Olin Wright, who had the sort of famous formulation that, workers are not just separated from the means of production, but also from the means of subsistence. So if we can at least guarantee the second part of that, that seems like a huge step forward. But the heart of your article is really kind of taking that assumption and sort of taking it apart. So why can UBI, which sounds great, not actually deliver us a post-work society?
Good, yeah. So what in the article, what I'm looking at is the role of the UBI in the wider post-work argument, because there are about 10,000 different kinds of arguments for UBI, as you say.
Right.
And it's impossible to really address them all at once because they're actually very different arguments for sometimes very different policies. So I'm not trying to make a general argument about UBI. I'm just trying to make an argument about how post-work socialism thinks about freedom through this really crucial policy device. Because the role of the UBI in the post-work vision is the reason we're free is because all of our basic needs are met, not conditional on working. Right? So the UBI in the post-work vision then has to be unconditional on working, universal, right? It's for everybody. Basic in the sense that it is at a level high enough to meet all of your basic needs. So it's not partial, right? And it's an income. It's given to you in the form of some money where you then choose sort of the particular basic goods that you're going to buy. So, and the reason, just, again, just to hammer home the point is this is going to matter because it's claimed that this UBI emancipates everybody because it means that nobody's forced to work and we can be socially indifferent about what people choose to do with their time. That's the really important sort of fact about the UBI in a post-work socialist view. And I think that is that it's deceptive, that it's deceptive because when you imagine a society like this, they're saying, look, come be a socialist and join our particular struggle because we're offering you a future society in which everyone can be free in this way. No one's going to be forced to work and we can be indifferent as to how people choose to use their time. The problem is that in that world, the post-work socialists are presupposing the very thing that they're saying they're freeing us from. They're presupposing a whole bunch of necessary labor that they're then saying nobody has to do. Nobody's forced to do. And they're presupposing it because for the UBI to work in that world, there have to be things to buy. And not just any goods, right? It can't be like, toy sailboats and tennis balls and, like paper napkins. It's got to be the basic goods, right? We have to be able to meet all of our basic needs by buying the basic goods that we need to survive. And it's not just basic goods. It has to be enough basic goods that everybody could buy them at the same time with their UBI. And it has to be not just enough basic goods at today. It's got to be basic goods plus all the raw materials and industrial machinery that's available to produce the basic goods tomorrow and the next day and the next day. So you have to produce and reproduce all those raw materials and do all the production of the machines that are going to produce your basic goods next time. So the food, the clothing, the medical care, the teaching, the child care, all this stuff. And some of this is physical good, a lot of this is actually physical goods. So for the UBI to be emancipating in the way they say, right? Because you've got to be able to buy this stuff. Somebody's got to be producing all those goods that you buy.
Right.
But who's doing that, right? So it's presupposing all this necessary labor. And so there's something very deceptive about saying this is a free society in the sense that nobody's forced to work, right, and we can be indifferent to what people do with their free time. In fact, you could say it might be true that it's not conditional on any particular individual doing work, but it is conditional on some people, on many people doing quite a bit of work,
right,
to produce those necessary goods.
Right. So yeah, let's stay on this question of necessary labor, right? Why does the kind of post-work explanation of, technology and automation as a way to deal with that labor that would have to occur in a post-work society, not cover all the bases? Because as you kind of hinted at earlier, we hear all the time that capitalism produces not just bad jobs, but like what David Graeber called bullshit jobs, like completely like pointless kind of make work tasks, and that there probably is a better and more efficient way of organizing work. But again, this is to say, why does technology and automation not cover all of the questions of necessary labor?
Sure. Yeah, if it did, then we wouldn't have to worry about the fact that some labor has to be done, right?
Right.
And that'd be good news, because really the problem for the post-work socialist view isn't just that it presupposes the necessary labor, that it has to be done, and implies that it's kind of not a political problem that we have to solve. Like, how are we going to determine what counts as the needs? And then who's going to do the necessary labor, right, and on what terms, and how's that going to be distributed? Or really, what's going to count as necessary? But then we also have reason to worry that in the post-work social society, uniquely, nobody would do it, because not only are people being given this UBI, but also they've attacked the work ethic, which would be the other source of motivation to work, right? So they've successfully destroyed any of the ways in which you might have a general supply of labor to do it. And they've just avoided, and I should just parenthetically, because at this point people might think that I'm just some kind of capitalist, I've written this in order to defend a different view, which I call shared labor socialism.
We'll get to that.
Where we share. Yeah, good. I just want to make sure at this stage someone doesn't press,
right.
Jacobin invited a crazy capitalist. So it's worse, right? They presuppose necessary labor without acknowledging it and give us reason to believe it wouldn't be done, in which case the UBI would be useless and you'd fall back into some other labor system. But then what about automation? And I think the problem with automation is this. I think automation is a partial solution to the problem, but it's a partial and subordinate one. It's not the answer. And the reason is there are many jobs that you could automate, many forms of necessary labor that probably would get automated if there were if we already lived in a democratic and socialist society in which we were able to collectively control and decide what's going to be automated and what isn't, rather than leaving up to what is profitable to automate. But it's only a partial subordinate one, because there are some forms of labor that are intrinsically not automatable. So that's one thing, right? Mm-hmm. There are many forms of caring labor that are just intrinsically not automatable. Teaching, caring, all kinds of medical provision. And there's quite a bit of that labor, especially in a society, and in a, kind of an advanced industrial society, where there's a lot more of that work to do. Right? So that's one thing. I think there's intrinsically not automatable work. There's other kinds of work where you can probably automate like 90% of it, but people still need to do some of it. Mm-hmm. And in the long term, in any sort of future I can kind of imagine, that's work that some people will have to do. There's also the work of maintaining the machines. right? There's all kinds of work. I mean, automation gets rid of some labor and creates new labor. And it does that continuously. Like we see that with machines, right? That's that you can kind of eliminate 10 jobs, but you create 1 or 2 new ones that human beings have to do. Right. And then there is just sort of labor of superintendents. I mean, there's people who still have to be there managing and watching machines. So it might not be particularly effortful, but it still requires human beings. So that's one class of reasons why I think that automation's a partial one. So I do think that it's true in a democratic socialist society. In one sense, necessary labor, you could automate away a lot of labor. You wouldn't just get rid of the bullshit jobs, right? You could automate a lot of labor and reduce the necessary labor people have to do to a relatively small share of the work week. So I'm not rejecting that. But the one other thing I wanted to say is that the 2 other reasons I think automation isn't as strong an answer as post-work socialists have made it out to be, and I have to say I used to think that too. So I this is sort of self-criticism as well, is first, you can't automate automation. So you first have to have a political process of determining what's going to count as a need. You have to have some political determination of needs or some social choice about needs to know then what's the kind of labor we're going to call necessary and therefore want to automate away first. Right? Or reduce through automation. And automation isn't self-automating, right? People sometimes just think it's just assumed we can just automate any task can be automated and we do it. But there's an infinite number of needs that can be satisfied. And machines can't tell us where we should direct our efforts. At any given moment in time, we can't automate everything. Right. So that's a political problem. That's part of the political problem of necessary labor, is deciding what's going to count. The second is that there's a way in which necessary labor, all things being equal, will increase in a future emancipated society because human needs will expand. And I think post-work socialists are really kind of much more vague about this than they are clear. Sometimes they talk about needs as just what we need to survive. That's the UBI thing, right? Oh, well, so long as we have our basic needs met, then there are no other needs, right? There's nothing else that must be produced. Right. Everything else is just free time. But as a kind of Marxist, and I think it's a pretty standard thought in a lot of Marxism and socialism, part of the point of emancipated society is that our needs expand. It's capitalism that reduces people's needs to what it takes to show up to work the next day, right? The basic needs thing. But a future society is one in which we have a need for the development and realization of our talents. But that actually requires an immense amount of resources. If you want to be a scientist, or you want to be an urban planner, or you want to be involved in urban planning, right? If you want to, kind of stage massive music concerts, you can just think of a million tasks, right? That require resources. You need access to some share of the means of production, not just the means of subsistence. Right. If what you want is to realize and, develop and realize that aspect of you and contribute it to society. But that takes resources. So all that stuff has to be produced, and we have to think of those goods as necessary. So there's going to be an increase in necessary labor, which means there's more tasks that would have to be automated, or at least an expansion of necessary labor from that perspective.
Right. So I think on that note, let's maybe then turn to your vision of a kind of different post-capitalist or socialist society, right? Yeah. I'll go ahead and say in your piece, you advocate for something that you called shared labor socialism. And I have a few questions about that, but I think maybe let's start with this kind of idea of work ethic, since, as you pointed out, that is a big part of the kind of post-work framework. So, we've already discussed the kind of post-work critique of the work ethic. Where does your kind of framework disagree with the post-work thinkers on this? And maybe another way of asking the question is, what do you think a socialist or at least non-capitalist work ethic might look like?
Yeah, thanks. So it's a really good question. And I'll be honest, there's parts of this I'm still working out for myself, because in some way I feel like I can say I came to this honestly, in the sense that this isn't how I originally thought. And I found I originally found it unnatural to think this way. I was with the post-work socialists. And when I thought more and more about it, and especially this, why the interest in the work ethic, came to the conclusion that there's something actually quite fundamental to the post-work view, which was this one, which underlies the work ethic thing, which is I think that a lot of post-work thinking, and this is also what's going on in the automation stuff, is the idea that because work is necessary, it must be unfree. And I realized that's just not true, as it turns out. All right, that I think is actually a first thing to say. Just because something's necessary does not make it unfree. And that's because what's necessary is also indeterminate, right? It's true, some work has to be done. But which work and under which conditions and by whom is not determined. That's why we have, like history. We have modes of production. We have different work relations, is because that isn't given to us. And it's capitalism, in a way, that constantly kind of reduces work into something merely necessary, just a means to some other ends. That's in part because all work is organized around profit, right? The workers, the conditions under which they work are determined by whether hiring them and having them work that way is profitable. And you have no reason to do work for the sake of profit. But in a shared labor socialist society, as I see it, it would change the character of the necessary labor, because necessary labor would be shared. Everyone would do some, so that nobody had to spend their whole life doing all of it. And it would be work that everyone has a reason to do, therefore, because it means that they are not contributing their efforts to a society that just uses them. They're contributing their efforts to a society that has their freedom as its aim, right? And you start that by sharing the necessary labor. That reduces the amount that anyone has to do to a relatively small amount. It does create real free time then to use time as you like, including to go and develop and contribute your talents if you want. But that would then mean that work has been transformed from something merely necessary into something that is an expression of human solidarity. And therefore, even that part of the day that is in some sense necessary, right, is something that could be the expression of a kind of duty people have as free people, right? We only have duties if we're free, right? If we can choose to do it for the sake of doing it as a duty, not just because we're sort of just forced to do it. And I think this is actually one of the oldest thoughts in communism. It goes back to Gracchus Babeuf, the first kind of modern communist, which is to say that we can transform work into a kind of civic act, whereby we contribute our abilities to the creation of society that is organized for the sake of everyone's freedom. And so that means that even the necessary part of the day, as it were, becomes an expression of our freedom and becomes an act of solidarity rather than mere necessity. And I know that sounds in some ways very abstract, but I think it matters because to me, it's the part of the work ethic even today that I think is at once reasonable and incipiently socialist. When people, the post-work view of the work ethic is to say it's just a capitalist ideology. It's just a way of inducing people to consent to their own exploitation. And I think that that's not the way ideology tends to work, at least not in this case. What it does is take something totally reasonable in people, which is that everybody should do their share. Right? That's the incipiently socialist thought. Yeah, everybody should do their share. But the problem in capitalism, there's no way for people to do their share in a way that isn't already sort of just contributing to the maintenance and reproduction of a capitalist society. That's the problem, right? Is their subjective orientation is just in conflict with just the objective institutional meaning of what they do. And so it's natural for some people to kind of react against that and say, well, I just refuse. Like the true way out of this ideology is I refuse. I don't want to do any work. I'm going to reject work. I'm going to refuse. I'm going to be against it. But the problem is that attitude is just as ideological as the work ethic one, because then it just flips the whole situation on its head and says, well, work can't be meaningful. It can be nothing but a form of kind of externally imposed necessity on us. And I think the problem is it's not, in the end, what's in our heads. It's the institutional organization of work. And so I'm inclined to think that a shared labor society would be based on its own work ethic, a widespread norm that everybody ought to do their share. And in fact, if everybody were ready, or if, the vast majority of people were ready to do their share, you wouldn't need to force them. You wouldn't need to force anyone to do it because they would do it spontaneously, right? They do it freely. You wouldn't need to compel them. You wouldn't need to, constrain benefits so that people were forced to work for their benefits. In fact, there'd be good reason to think that we wouldn't make the share of what people produce dependent on how much work they do, because we would want work to be done for non-instrumental reasons, right? The whole idea would be for work to be an expression of our freedom and solidarity. We wouldn't attach what you earn to the amount of effort you put in. We would just say you do your share, and in exchange, you get a share of what you need to be a kind of self-developing person who can contribute their talents to society.
Right. Let me ask you this, though. Does this conception maybe rest on like an assumption about human nature? Because, you know, humans being humans, I just like can't help but think there's always going to be somebody who's like, I'd rather kick up my feet and like not do the work, right? And in terms of, you know, I think what you're proposing, like in some distant socialist future, everybody has to work 4 hours a week doing the kind of undesirable or necessary labor tasks that can't be automated away. You show up, you know, for a very reduced time at the factory or whatever, like, you know, tinkering with the robots that are doing the other work, like that's all well and good. But I guess, you know, maybe talk a little bit more about how you see this like work ethic kind of cohering.
Good. So if it's a hard question to answer only because it's unclear to me what is human nature and how we know it compared to just sort of human beings as we have encountered them in a world that we've made. Right. So, you know, some people think, well, people are always going to shirk. You know, if you don't force people to work, they're just not going to work. And that is, you know, an old conservative view, or it's predominantly conservative. But to the degree that we worry this might just be inscribed in our nature, it's worth pointing out that I think a future shared labor socialist society would have social norms. It would have a work ethic, which means that we would tend to disapprove of people who didn't do their share, right? Because we can't be socially indifferent to what other people do. And I think we can't be socially indifferent because no individual satisfies their needs through their own labor. We're all mutually interdependent. And that means that we can't actually be totally indifferent to what people do with their time. Our freedom depends upon how we institutionally set this up and upon what others do. And the question is just whether we can accept the demands of others as reasons for our own action or not, right? So one answer then is, well, to the degree that people might be naturally reluctant to even do their share, you know, in a future kind of emancipated society, there would be social pressure.
Right.
We wouldn't force them, right? Well, that's the ideal, right?
Right.
So the ideal is you wouldn't force them, right? We wouldn't have it wouldn't be conscription at gunpoint. It wouldn't be that you won't live if you don't do your share, right? So there would be that, but there would be, unlike the post-work view, there wouldn't be this social indifference towards what people do with their time. You would be socialized into a society in which it was held to be a good thing to be ready to contribute your talents and abilities to society generally, and where that would mean you don't just get total personal choice over your time, right? There's social determination of what the needs are, what the valuable contributions are, at least when you're ready just to do your share of what has to be done. But probably, I can't imagine that not bleeding into how you use your free time generally. Right. We would tend to then admire, oh, look at the person who kind of invented this incredible machine that now makes it possible for everyone to dispose of all of their household waste without anyone having to be involved in garbage collection or something. You know, like that would be an invention, right? Look at the person who figured out how to, you know, actually create tunnels from city to city so that we could, you know, use underground trains traveling at multiple times the speed of sound. You know, that would be a huge enterprise involving a lot of people using their free time, right? So to some degree, then the answer is, well, people will feel sometimes quite intense social pressure, right, to use their time. But I think, you know, ideally we would also tolerate some degree, right, of people not doing it. The second thing is, I just don't think it's true. It's true that we enjoy kicking our feet up and socializing and having free time, and there would be, I think, a lot more time for that. But I think that our sense of what we want to do with our free time is so intensely shaped with how work is organized now that I find it. I'm not inclined to think that we can observe how people use their time now as a really good guide.
Right.
And people have a reason to want to make a mark on society, to make something of themselves.
Yeah.
And at the very minimum, we'd have to live in a society that made it possible for everyone to do that, even if they didn't take that opportunity. And that would require the resources to do that, right? Like the thought experiment I give is like, imagine we want to make it possible for people to pursue scientific career if they wanted. So that means they'd have to be educated in basic science. Like just imagine what it would take for every high school to have like a proper chemistry lab so they could learn chemistry. It's actually like a lot.
Yeah.
We have really shitty, school systems. So like you go to private school and have really good, or if you go to like a wealthy suburban high school, then you have good chemistry labs. What if everybody did? That's
right.
Actually takes a lot. You got to produce a lot. You got to need all the beakers and the acids and the bases and all whatever. I don't remember my high school chemistry very well. But
that wouldn't be your chosen
point.
career path.
Yeah. Before you even get to the point then of thinking, well, I'm going to see if I can, try to be a scientist.
Mm-hmm. So maybe then, this is obviously a broad question, and it is a little bit outside the scope of your article, but I do want to ask, you have this vision of shared labor socialism. What are kind of the steps or reforms that could put us on that path? And the reason I ask that, of course, is because the big thing for the post-work theorists is, as we've been discussing, UBI. So are there policy proposals that you think, kind of move us in that direction?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, it's a good question because one of the arguments I made, and one of the reasons I thought it was important to do this critique of post-work socialism is that one very reasonable claim they make is any struggle, the development of any left-wing political struggle today would require a vision of the future.
Right.
Something that makes the struggle worth it, since it's risky, it's timely, it's it's long-term. Many of the people involved now will never see it, all that kind of thing. So it has to be something that's really compelling enough. And I wanted to point out that these weird ways in which they presuppose the very thing that they say they emancipate us from, and even more so than their hostility to the work ethic, is in the end a liability, because all they can end up doing is then seeing people who are committed to the work ethic as politically problematic. They don't see what's reasonable in already existing views about the work and the work ethic. And I think many people are resistant to the UBI, not for ideological reasons, but for reasonable reasons. They understand that some work has to be done, and that therefore some different kind of political visions needed to avoid the political liabilities of that post-work view, no matter how much it might seem compelling. But that was a negative point. It was to say, what's attractive, I think, about shared labor socialism is that it overcomes some of the political liabilities of the kind of deceptions and mistakes of the post-work view. But I don't think I have any political policy to offer that would take us there. And that's because I don't think the problem is a policy one. I don't think there's a kind of midpoint or a first step thing. Because I think the fundamental problem is the lack of a well-organized workers' movement. So the answer to your question would be, because there's no way of getting there without a very well-organized workers' movement with its own party, that's able to actually control, because it would involve a dramatic change in property relations, right? And it would involve an immense conflict. And so that immense conflict can only be won if there's already a very well-organized workers' movement that has its own party that it can control in a democratic way, that could be used then to, seize the state and reorganize the economy. And so the answer is whatever, and I don't claim to have an answer to this. I'm just saying the form of the answer would be, if there are policies that would help and assist the development of that movement, then that's the one. Right. So, sometimes I think people sniff out that the problem with the UBI is there's a suspicious amount of support for it amongst neoliberals, right?
Right, yeah.
And I think the truth of that is that here and now, what a UBI is demobilizing, not mobilizing. And the clearest example, I think, was COVID, right? We got everyone to stay indoors without protest by paying them off. And the most intense form of demobilization that we've had in a very long time. So, and, that's a kind of background resistance I have to UBI is the UBI, like anything right now, is not going to be the expression of workers' power that they would use then to build more power. It's going to be individualizing, atomizing. So I don't think we can really say policy X does something absent the political context and whose victory it is. And so the problem's a political one. So all I can do is offer this as a vision that I think is more essential and compelling as a way of thinking about freedom, and which one could offer through the agency of some independent political party. It's a standard. It's also, in a way, where you can see UBI getting absorbed into democratic thinking. I have trouble believing they'd really go in for shared labor socialism. So I think it would have to be the offering of a real independent political party from the mainstream parties. And, what it would mean, I don't think there's, so that's my answer,
Yeah. All right. Well, Alex Gourevitch, again, has an article in Catalyst titled Post-Work Socialism, ? Alex, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thanks for the interview. It was great.